Hi, I'm Maya. My family called me a disappointment, the one who'd never amount to anything. Then, when my war veteran dad died, they handed me his worthless diary like it was some consolation prize. They had no idea what he'd really been hiding all those years, and I wasn't the broken daughter they thought I was. Before we dive in, what time are you listening and where from? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Stay with me because the discovery I made left even the lawyers speechless. I hadn't planned on going through Dad's thing so soon, certainly not 3 days after the funeral, but my stepmother Linda made it clear I wasn't welcome to grieve in peace. The modest ranch house in Riverside felt smaller than I remembered, packed with relatives I barely recognized, all of them eyeing Dad's belongings like vultures circling roadkill. The California heat pressed through the windows as I sat in his cramped study, surrounded by cardboard boxes that smelled of Old Spice and disappointment. Linda appeared in the doorway, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light, arms crossed in that way that meant she was about to deliver news I wouldn't like. Maya, honey, we need to discuss your father's estate. Her voice carried that sugary tone she used when she wanted something, the same one she'd perfected during her 5 year marriage to my dad. Behind her lurked my half brother Connor, 22, and already sporting the entitled smirk of someone who'd never worked for anything in his life. Dad's will reading had been yesterday, a brief affair in a stuffy law office downtown where the attorney, Mr. Hendricks, had delivered the expected news with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. The house went to Linda, along with Dad's modest savings account and his truck. Connor received Dad's tools and workshop equipment, probably worth more than everything else combined. I got the remainder, which consisted of Dad's military uniforms, some faded photographs, and a leather bound diary he'd apparently kept during his service in Afghanistan. The diary's kind of useless, isn't it? Connor had said after the reading, flipping through pages filled with Dad's careful handwriting. Just a bunch of boring war stories and complaining about the heat. He'd tossed it back to me like it was contaminated, and I'd clutched it against my chest, fighting back tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage. Now, sitting in Dad's study while Linda cleared her throat impatiently, I felt that same burning sensation behind my ribs. I know this is hard, sweetie, she continued, though her eyes held all the warmth of a January morning. But Connor and I need to start clearing out these rooms. The realtor says staged homes sell faster, and with the market being what it is. She let the sentence hang there, a polite eviction notice wrapped in false sympathy. I looked around the study one more time, taking in the Purple Heart mounted on the wall, the stack of military history books, the photo of Dad in his dress uniform looking impossibly young and proud. 23 years of service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and this was what he'd left behind. A handful of memories and a daughter who couldn't even afford to contest his will. I understand, I said, though understanding and accepting were two completely different things entirely. I'd been living in a studio apartment in Long Beach since my divorce, working double shifts at the medical center just to make rent. The idea of finding a new place to live felt overwhelming, but Linda's plastic smile made it clear I didn't have much choice in the matter. Connor shifted in the doorway, checking his phone with the attention span of a goldfish. Mom, can we hurry this up? I'm supposed to meet Jake at the beach house. Linda's beach house, bought with money she'd inherited from her first husband. Another detail that made my father's modest estate seem even more pathetic by comparison. Of course, darling, Linda replied, then turned back to me. Maya, I've packed up most of your father's personal items. They're in those boxes by the window. I figured you'd want to go through them at your own place. Take your time deciding what to keep. What she really meant was she wanted me gone, wanted to erase every trace of my father's first marriage and the daughter who reminded her that she'd been wife number two. I stood up, my back aching from hunching over the boxes, and walked to the window where 3 cardboard containers sat waiting. They looked pitifully small for a man who'd lived 61 years, who'd served his country with honor, who'd worked construction for 2 decades after leaving the army. Everything that mattered to James Robert Castellanos, reduced to 3 boxes and a diary his stepson had dismissed as worthless. The first box contained his uniforms, pressed and folded with military precision, even after all these years. I ran my fingers over the fabric, remembering how proud he'd looked in dress blues at military functions, how he'd taught me to iron the creases sharp enough to cut paper. The second box held photographs. Dad as a young soldier, dad with his unit in Afghanistan, dad at my high school graduation before the drinking got bad, before mom's cancer treatment bills bankrupted us, before everything fell apart. The third box was heavier, filled with papers and documents I'd need to sort through later. Tax returns, medical records, copies of official military correspondence. At the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, I found more photographs and what looked like official military documents with portions blacked out. Dad had never talked much about his time overseas, just said he'd done his job and come home, but these papers suggested there might have been more to his service than he'd let on. Linda checked her watch, a gesture as subtle as a fire alarm. I hate to rush you, honey, but the cleaning crew is coming tomorrow morning. If you could just grab those boxes and anything else you need. She trailed off, but the message was clear. I was being evicted from my father's memory, politely but firmly shown the door. I picked up the diary, its leather cover worn smooth from handling, and flipped it open to a random page. Dad's handwriting looked back at me, neat and controlled, despite the conditions he must have been writing under. Day 47 in Sector 12, one entry began. Found something today that changed everything. Can't write details here, but when I get home, M will understand. She's the only one who gets it. M. That was me. Maya. He'd been thinking about me even in that desert hell, planning to tell me something important when he returned, but he'd never told me. Not during those difficult years after mom died, not during the period when his PTSD was at its worst, not even during our last conversation 3 weeks ago when he'd called to check on me after my divorce became final. Whatever he'd found, whatever had changed everything, he'd taken it to his grave. Connor appeared at my elbow, making me jump. Are you done yet? I want to grab Dad's good drill bits before you leave. He'd never called my father Dad while he was alive. Always stuck to Jim or Mr. Castellanos when forced to acknowledge him at all. Now that there was inheritance involved, suddenly he was family. Connor, Linda said sharply, let Maya finish. But her tone suggested I'd better finish quickly. I closed the diary and tucked it under my arm along with the 3 boxes. As I loaded them into my beat-up Honda Civic, I could feel Linda and Connor watching from the kitchen window, probably discussing how quickly they could get the house on the market. Dad had been gone 72 hours, and already they were erasing him, turning his life into square footage and asking prices. The drive back to Long Beach took an hour in traffic, giving me plenty of time to think about missed opportunities and unspoken conversations. Dad and I had been close when I was younger, before high school and boyfriends and my desperate need to fit in had created distance between us. After Mom died, we'd grown even further apart, both of us drowning in our own grief and unable to help each other stay afloat. My apartment felt even smaller with the addition of 3 boxes and a lifetime of regret. I set them on my kitchen counter and opened a beer, staring at the diary that had supposedly been worthless according to my half-brother's expert assessment. The leather was scarred and faded, held together with what looked like military-grade tape. Dad had clearly handled it often, probably reading through his own words during those long nights when the nightmares kept him awake. I opened it to the first page, dated 14 years ago when Dad was deployed to Afghanistan for his second tour. The early entries were mundane, complaints about the heat and dust, observations about local customs, brief mentions of patrol routes and equipment issues. Standard soldier stuff, exactly what Connor had dismissed as boring war stories. But as I read deeper, the tone shifted. Dad started writing about archaeological sites, ancient trade routes, historical significance of regions they were patrolling. He'd always been interested in history, but this was different. This was focused, purposeful, like he was documenting something specific. References to coordinates, measurements, geological surveys. Notes about permission from local authorities, cooperation with international preservation groups. One entry caught my attention. The tribal elder, Rashid, says his grandfather spoke of treasure hidden by merchants fleeing Alexander's armies. Probably folklore, but the geographic markers match what we've been finding. Worth investigating further. Treasure. Dad had been treasure hunting in Afghanistan, apparently with official backing and local cooperation. I flipped ahead, looking for more references to this treasure, this discovery that supposedly changed everything. The entries became more cryptic, filled with references to grid coordinates and depth measurements, sketches of cave systems and geological formations. Then, about halfway through the diary, the entries stopped entirely. Just blank pages, as if Dad had decided to stop recording whatever he'd been doing, except for one final entry dated just a month before he returned home. Package secure, transport arranged through official channels, location logged with appropriate authorities. M's future is safe now. We'll explain everything when I'm stateside, but if something happens to me, she needs to know about the Bank of San Francisco, Box 247. The key is where she'd expect it to be. My hand started shaking as I read the words again. Bank of San Francisco, Box 247. A safe deposit box, apparently containing something Dad thought would secure my future. And somewhere in his belongings was a key I was supposed to find, hidden where I'd expect it to be. I looked around my tiny apartment, at the three boxes I'd barely begun to explore, at the diary that suddenly felt like a treasure map instead of a collection of war stories. Connor had been wrong. This wasn't worthless at all. This was the beginning of something that was about to change everything, just like Dad had promised all those years ago in that Afghan desert. The question was, where would I expect to find a key? I spent the rest of that evening turning my apartment upside down, searching through every item I'd brought from Dad's house with the methodical precision he'd taught me during those weekend camping trips when I was 12. The phrase, where she'd expect it to be, echoed in my mind like a riddle I should already know the answer to. Dad had always been a man of patterns, someone who believed in hiding things in plain sight while maintaining plausible deniability. The first place I looked was inside his military uniform jacket, running my fingers along every seam and checking each pocket twice. Nothing. I examined the photo frames, looking for anything taped to the back or hidden behind the pictures themselves. Still nothing. The documents yielded no obvious hiding spots, just more evidence of Dad's meticulous record keeping and a growing stack of medical bills from his final months that Linda had conveniently forgotten to mention during the will reading. By midnight, I was sitting on my kitchen floor surrounded by the scattered contents of three boxes, feeling more frustrated than hopeful. Dad's words kept cycling through my thoughts. Where would I expect it to be? What did that even mean? I'd expected him to live longer than 61. I'd expected him to finally open up about his military service. I'd expected a lot of things that never materialized. I picked up the diary again, this time examining the binding itself. The leather cover was thick, substantial, the kind of field journal designed to survive harsh conditions. I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling for any irregularities, any indication that something might be sewn inside. The spine felt slightly thicker than it should, but that could just be from years of use. And the desert climate Dad had described in his entries. Then I noticed something I'd missed earlier. The military tape holding the journal together wasn't random field repairs. It was deliberate, applied in specific places with careful precision. I peeled back one corner and my heart stopped. Underneath the tape, a small slit had been cut into the leather, just wide enough to slide something thin inside. I worked carefully, not wanting to damage whatever Dad had hidden there. The opening was tight, but my fingertips found something hard and metallic. Slowly, I extracted a small brass key, tarnished with age but still solid. It was unlike any key I'd seen before, stamped with numbers that meant nothing to me but felt significant. 247SF was engraved along the side in tiny letters. Box 247, San Francisco. I sat there holding the key, feeling like I'd just solved the first piece of an enormous puzzle. Dad had been right. I should have expected to find it in his diary. The one thing he'd made sure I would inherit, the one thing Connor had dismissed as worthless. My father might not have been the most emotionally available parent, but he'd understand me well enough to know I'd read every word he'd written, that I'd examine every detail with the same obsessive thoroughness he'd taught me. Sleep was impossible after that discovery. I spent the rest of the night researching the Bank of San Francisco online, learning that it was a small but prestigious institution that specializes in private banking and estate services. Their safe deposit box program required two forms of identification: the original key and either the box holder or someone with documented legal authority to access the contents. As Dad's sole beneficiary of personal effects, I technically had that authority, but something told me this situation was going to be more complicated than a simple inheritance claim. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. My supervisor, Janet, was understanding when I explained that I was dealing with my father's estate, though she reminded me that I'd already used my bereavement days. I assured her I'd be back tomorrow, though privately I wondered if that would be true. Whatever was in that safe deposit box, it felt like the kind of discovery that could change everything. The drive to San Francisco took 4 hours in morning traffic, giving me plenty of time to imagine what Dad might have left for me. The diary entries about treasure and merchants fleeing Alexander's armies could have been military fantasy, the kind of stories soldiers told themselves to make deployment more bearable. But the key was real, the bank was real, and Dad's final entry had been written with the careful precision of someone documenting facts, not fiction. I'd dressed professionally for the bank visit, wearing the one good suit I owned and carrying a briefcase that had belonged to my ex husband. Inside were copies of Dad's death certificate, the will, my identification, and the diary itself. I wasn't sure what the bank would require, but I wanted to be prepared for any questions about my right to access the box. The Bank of San Francisco occupied a corner building in the financial district, its facade a mixture of classical architecture and modern security features. Inside, the lobby was hushed and elegant, with marble floors and oil paintings that probably cost more than my annual salary. A receptionist with silver hair and kind eyes directed me to the safe deposit box department after I explained my situation. Mrs. Chen, the department manager, was a woman in her 50s who examined my documents with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent decades protecting other people's secrets. She studied Dad's death certificate, compared my identification to the authorized access list, and spent several minutes reviewing the original will with a magnifying glass. "Your father established this box 14 years ago," she said finally, "immediately after returning from military deployment. He paid the rental fees annually, always in cash, always exactly on time. Very reliable customer." She paused, studying my face as if trying to determine whether I could be trusted with whatever secrets Dad had left behind. He also left specific instructions that if anything happened to him, only you were authorized to access the contents. Not his spouse, not other family members. Only Maya Castellanos. The precision of that instruction hit me like a physical blow. Dad had known, even 14 years ago, that Linda couldn't be trusted with whatever he'd hidden. He'd understood that Connor would never respect anything connected to his first family. Somehow, despite all the distance between us, despite all the conversations we'd never had, he'd still been protecting me. Mrs. Chen led me through a series of security doors, each one requiring a different access code or biometric scan. The safe deposit box vault was smaller than I'd expected, lined with hundreds of numbered compartments of various sizes. Box 247 was located in the middle section, larger than a typical safety deposit box, but smaller than the commercial-sized units along the bottom row. "I'll need both keys," Mrs. Chen explained, producing her own key from a secured cabinet. "Bank policy requires dual access for all safe deposit boxes." We inserted our keys simultaneously, and the box slid out smoothly on well-oiled tracks. Inside was a heavy canvas bag, military issued and sealed with wax and tape. Next to it lay a thick manila envelope with my name written across the front in Dad's careful handwriting. Mrs. Chen gestured toward a private viewing room where I could examine the contents without observation, standard procedure for safe deposit box access. I carried both items into the small windowless room and set them on the polished wooden table. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope first, hoping for an explanation before I discovered what Dad had considered worth hiding for 14 years. The letter inside was written on legal letterhead, dated just 6 months ago, apparently updated shortly before Dad's final illness. "Maya," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found the key where I hoped you would. I'm sorry for all the secrets, all the distance between us these past years. I wanted to tell you about this discovery 100 times, but the legal implications were too complex, and I needed to be sure everything was handled properly through official channels. Many invasions that swept through that region over the centuries. The find was documented, cataloged, and processed through proper military and international authorities. According to international law and agreements with the Afghan government, archaeological discoveries made during military operations can be claimed by the discovering party after a 7-year waiting period, provided all legal requirements are met and appropriate fees are paid. I've spent the past 14 years navigating that bureaucracy, working with lawyers and government officials to ensure everything was handled correctly. The gold in this box represents about half of the original discovery. The other half was donated to the Afghan National Museum, as required by international treaty. What remains is legally yours now, worth approximately $12 million dollars at current market prices. I've included all the documentation proving legal ownership, along with contacts for dealers who can help you convert it to currency if that's what you choose. I know this is overwhelming. I know you have questions I can't answer now, but I want you to know that every decision I made, every secret I kept, was about protecting this discovery until you were old enough and stable enough to handle it responsibly. You're stronger than you know, smarter than you give yourself credit for, and you deserve a future that isn't limited by other people's expectations or prejudices. The gold is yours, but more importantly, your freedom is yours. Use both wisely. I love you more than I ever found the words to say. Dad. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. $12 million dollars in gold, legally mine. Sitting in a canvas bag 3 feet away from where I was trembling in a bank vault in downtown San Francisco, I opened the bag with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and found myself staring at more gold than I'd ever imagined outside of a museum display. Ancient coins, jewelry, small ingots, all of it tarnished with age but unmistakably precious. Each piece was tagged with catalog numbers and accompanied by documentation that looked official enough to satisfy any government agency. Mrs. Chen knocked softly on the viewing room door. Everything all right, Ms. Castellanos? You've been in there for quite a while. I looked at the gold, at the letter, at the legal documents that proved my father had spent 14 years making sure I would inherit something that could change my life completely. Linda and Connor thought they'd gotten the valuable parts of Dad's estate. They had no idea what the worthless diary had really been worth. Everything's fine, I called back, though fine seemed like a massive understatement. I just need a few more minutes to process everything. I carefully repacked the golden documents, my mind racing with possibilities and questions. Dad had trusted me with something extraordinary, something that proved he'd been protecting me all along, even when it felt like we were drifting apart. The question now was what to do with that trust and how to honor both his memory and his sacrifice. But first, I had to figure out how to get $12 million dollars in ancient gold out of a bank vault without attracting the wrong kind of attention. I sat in that viewing room for another hour trying to wrap my mind around the magnitude of what Dad had left me. The legal documents were extensive, filled with official seals and signatures from various government agencies, archaeological societies, and international law firms. Everything appeared legitimate, but the sheer complexity of the paperwork made me realize I was going to need professional help to navigate this situation properly. Mrs. Chen eventually returned, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the patient expression of someone who'd seen plenty of emotional family discoveries over the years. Would you like me to arrange for secure transport, Inuish? She asked quietly. We have relationships with several bonded courier services that specialize in valuable items. The practical question snapped me back to reality. I couldn't exactly stuff $12 million dollars worth of ancient gold into my Honda Civic and drive back to Long Beach. But I also wasn't ready to trust this discovery to strangers. Not when I was still processing the fact that it existed at all. I think I need to leave everything here for now, I said, gesturing to the canvas bag and documents. I need time to research my options, maybe consult with some experts before I make any decisions about transport or storage. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. Very wise. Many people want to rush into action when they discover valuable inheritances, but patience usually serves them better. The box rental is paid through the end of this year, and your father's instructions allow you unlimited access during business hours. I thanked her and gathered my personal items, keeping only dad's letter and a few photos of the gold pieces taken with my phone. The drive back to Long Beach felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's life. Every few minutes, I had to remind myself that this wasn't a dream, that my father had actually discovered buried treasure and somehow managed to claim it legally through proper channels. The first thing I did when I got home was call my best friend Sarah, who worked as a paralegal for a law firm specializing in estate planning. She'd been my roommate in college and was one of the few people who knew about my complicated relationship with my father and his military service. Maya, you sound weird, she said immediately. Are you okay? I know dealing with your dad's estate has been stressful. I found myself laughing, probably the first genuine laugh I'd had since dad's funeral. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to promise you'll keep it confidential until I figure out what I'm doing. Of course, what's going on? If someone inherited valuable items from a military parent, items that were legally acquired overseas during deployment, what kind of legal issues might they face? Sarah was quiet for a moment. That's oddly specific. Are we talking about art, antiquities, or just general valuable property? Antiquities. Potentially very valuable antiquities. Okay, well, the legal landscape for that kind of inheritance is complex. There are federal laws about importing cultural artifacts, international treaties about archaeological discoveries, and tax implications for high value inheritances. Plus, if the items were acquired during military service, there might be additional regulations about how they were documented and processed. She paused. Maya, please tell me your dad didn't leave you stolen artifacts. No, nothing was stolen. Everything was apparently processed through proper channels, documented by military authorities, and cleared through international law. But the value is significant. How significant are we talking? I took a deep breath. 8 figures. Sarah was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she said, Maya, you need to talk to someone who specializes in this kind of thing. My firm handles estates, but nothing at that level. I can give you some referrals to attorneys who work with high value inheritances and international law. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the evening researching the legal experts Sarah had recommended. One name kept appearing in articles about archaeological discoveries and military inheritance cases. Dr. Patricia Vance, a lawyer who specialized in cultural property law and had written extensively about the legal frameworks governing artifacts discovered during military operations. Her office was in Los Angeles, and her consultation fees were substantial. But given what was at stake, the investment seemed worthwhile. I scheduled an appointment for the following week, explaining only that I needed guidance on a complex military inheritance involving archaeological materials. The next few days passed in a strange haze of normalcy punctuated by moments of complete unreality. I went to work, dealt with my usual patients at the medical center, and pretended that my biggest concern was whether I could afford my rent next month. Meanwhile, I was secretly researching gold dealers, secure storage facilities, and tax implications for windfall inheritances. My half brother Connor called twice, both times asking if I'd found anything interesting in Dad's papers. His casual tone didn't fool me for a second. Linda had probably put him up to it, fishing for information about whether there might be any valuable items they'd overlooked during the estate settlement. Just some old military documents and photographs, that I told him. Nothing that would interest you. Yeah, well, if you find anything worth selling, let me know. I know some collectors who are interested in military memorabilia. The irony wasn't lost on me. Connor was basically offering to help me sell the most valuable military memorabilia discovery in recent history while having no idea what he was talking about. I thanked him politely and promised to keep his offer in mind. Linda called once, ostensibly to check on how I was handling my grief, but her questions kept circling back to Dad's personal effects and whether I'd found anything that might need to be properly appraised for insurance purposes. Her concern was touching. If you ignored the fact that she'd never shown any interest in Dad's military service while he was alive. I'm just going through everything slowly, I told her. You know how sentimental I get about Dad's things. Of course, dear. Just remember that some military items can be quite valuable to collectors. It would be terrible if you accidentally threw away something worth money. I assured her I'd be careful and ended the call as quickly as possible. The last thing I needed was Linda and Connor getting suspicious about my sudden interest in Dad's military history. Dr. Vance's office was located in a gleaming high rise in Century City, the kind of building where the elevator required a key card and the lobby art probably cost more than most people's cars. Her assistant, an efficient woman named Rebecca, offered me coffee and directed me to a conference room with floor to ceiling windows overlooking the city. Dr. Vance herself was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of professional confidence that came from dealing with complicated legal problems on a daily basis. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just absorbing the details with the focus of someone who'd heard similar stories before. Your father's approach was remarkably thorough, she said when I finished. Most military personnel who discover valuable artifacts either try to smuggle them home illegally or abandon them entirely because the legal process is so complex. The fact that he spent 14 years working through proper channels suggests he understood the implications and wanted to ensure everything was handled correctly. She reviewed the photographs I'd taken of the legal documents, occasionally cross-referencing them with materials from her own files. The documentation looks legitimate, and the agencies involved are the correct ones for this type of discovery. However, you're going to face several challenges as the inheritor. What kind of challenges? First, there's the matter of import documentation. Even though the gold was legally acquired, bringing it into the United States requires specific permits and declarations. Your father appears to have handled this correctly, but you'll need to verify that all the paperwork is current and properly filed. She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a timeline. Second, there are tax implications. The IRS considers inherited property to be income at fair market value, which means you'll owe taxes on the full $12 million value. Depending on your current tax bracket, that could be a substantial sum. My heart sank. I'd been so focused on the discovery itself that I'd barely considered the tax implications. How substantial? Potentially several $1 million, depending on how the inheritance is structured and what deductions might apply. The good news is that you have options for how to handle the payment, including selling portions of the collection to cover the tax burden. She continued outlining the various legal and financial steps I'd need to take, from securing proper insurance to finding reputable dealers who could authenticate and value the individual pieces. The process was going to take months, possibly years, and would require a team of specialists including appraisers, accountants, and additional legal counsel. I have to ask, Dr. Vance said as our consultation wound down, are you prepared for the attention this discovery might attract? $12 million in ancient gold isn't something you can keep quiet indefinitely. Once you begin the process of authentication and sale, word will spread within the archaeological and collecting communities. I hadn't considered that aspect either. What kind of attention? Media interest, academic researchers, potential buyers, and unfortunately, people who might question the legitimacy of your claim. Even with proper documentation, discoveries of this magnitude tend to attract skeptics and opportunists. She recommended keeping the discovery confidential until I'd assembled a complete legal team and developed a comprehensive plan for handling the inheritance. Your father spent 14 years protecting this discovery. Don't let impatience or pressure from others undermine his careful work. Driving back to Long Beach, I felt simultaneously overwhelmed and determined. Dad's gift was more complicated than I'd initially realized, but it was also more valuable than I dared to hope. The legal and financial challenges were significant, but they were manageable with the right professional help. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about money. Dad's careful documentation, his insistence that only I should inherit the gold, his 14 years of patient legal work. All of it suggested that he'd viewed this discovery as more than just a financial windfall. He'd seen it as my ticket to independence, my escape from the limitations that had defined my life so far. The question was whether I was strong enough to handle that kind of freedom and smart enough to honor the trust he'd placed in me. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into researching everything I could about Dad's military unit, the archaeological protocols for artifact discovery, and the specific region of Afghanistan where he'd been deployed. What I found painted a picture of my father that was completely different from the quiet, sometimes distant man I thought I knew. Dad's unit, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, had been tasked with more than just standard combat operations during their deployment. According to declassified military reports I found through online databases, they'd worked extensively with international preservation groups to protect cultural sites from looting and destruction. Dad's name appeared in several official commendations for his work with local tribal leaders and Afghan government representatives. But the most surprising discovery came when I contacted the Army Heritage Center in Pennsylvania. A helpful archivist named Colonel Williams, now retired, remembered my father personally. James Castellanos was one of our most dedicated cultural preservation specialists. He told me over the phone. He had a real gift for working with local communities, understanding the historical significance of archaeological sites. Not many soldiers had that kind of intellectual curiosity combined with the practical skills to document discoveries properly. Colonel Williams explained that Dad had actually been handpicked for the cultural preservation program because of his background in construction and his demonstrated interest in historical research. Your father wasn't just following orders when he documented that discovery. He was passionate about protecting cultural heritage, believed that preserving history was part of serving his country. This revelation hit me harder than finding the gold itself. I'd always seen Dad's military service as something he endured rather than embraced, a job that took him away from home and left him with nightmares he couldn't discuss. I'd never imagined him as someone who found meaning and purpose in protecting ancient treasures from destruction. Armed with this new understanding of my father, I began developing a more comprehensive plan for handling his legacy. Dr. Vance had referred me to a team of specialists. Marcus Rivera, a certified appraiser who specialized in ancient artifacts, Jennifer Chen, a tax attorney who handled high-value inheritances, and David Park, an accountant who worked with clients who'd received unexpected windfalls. The first team meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Dr. Vance's office. But before I could focus entirely on the technical aspects of claiming my inheritance, I had to deal with increasing pressure from my stepfamily, who were becoming more suspicious about my recent behavior. Linda called me at work on Friday afternoon, her voice carrying that particular edge that meant she'd been discussing something with Connor. Maya, dear, I've been thinking about your father's military papers. Connor mentioned that some of his army friends might be interested in purchasing memorabilia for their collections. I was standing in the medical center break room, trying to eat lunch between patient appointments, and her timing couldn't have been worse. I'm not really ready to sell anything yet, Linda. I'm still going through everything. Of course, I understand. But storage can be expensive, and some of those military documents might deteriorate if they're not properly preserved. It might be wise to let experts handle the valuable pieces. The word valuable hung in the air like a warning flag. Linda had never shown any interest in Dad's military service, never asked about his deployment experiences, never even attended the Veterans Day ceremonies he'd participated in after his retirement. Her sudden concern about proper preservation was transparently motivated by money. I'll keep that in mind, I said carefully. Thanks for thinking of me. Actually, Maya, there's something else. Connor ran into one of your father's old army buddies at the hardware store yesterday. Fellow named Martinez said he'd served with Jim in Afghanistan. He mentioned that Jim had talked about finding some interesting historical items during his deployment. My blood turned to ice water. Did he say anything specific? Nothing concrete, just that Jim had been excited about some archaeological work they'd been doing. Martinez seemed to think there might have been some kind of discovery, though he wasn't sure what happened with it. Linda paused, letting the implication sink in. I thought you should know, in case there are official documents or reports that might be worth preserving. I ended the call as quickly as possible, my hands shaking as I tried to figure out how much Linda actually knew versus how much she was fishing for. The fact that she'd tracked down one of Dad's former unit members suggested she was taking a much more active interest in his military history than I'd realized. That evening, I called Dr. Vance's office and left an urgent message about needing to accelerate our timeline. If Linda and Connor were actively investigating Dad's military service, it was only a matter of time before they discovered something that would complicate my legal position. Dr. Vance called me back within an hour. Maya, I understand your concern, but rushing into action could create more problems than it solves. However, there are some preliminary steps we can take to protect your position. She explained that we could file a formal claim of inheritance with the appropriate federal agencies, establishing my legal right to the artifacts before anyone else could challenge it. The documentation your father left is comprehensive, but having official recognition of your claim will make it much harder for other parties to interfere. We scheduled an emergency meeting for Saturday morning, despite the weekend timing. I spent Friday night going through Dad's papers again, this time focusing on anything that might reveal how much he'd shared with other people about his discovery. What I found was both reassuring and concerning. Dad had been incredibly discreet about the specific details of his find, but he'd clearly maintained contact with several members of his unit over the years. There were Christmas cards, occasional letters, and even a few emails from fellow veterans who referenced their shared experiences in Afghanistan. One email from someone named Staff Sergeant Martinez, dated just 3 months before Dad's death, was particularly worrying. Jim, I've been thinking about that site we worked on near Kandahar. My nephew's studying archaeology now, and when I mentioned some of the things we found, he got really excited. Said discoveries like that could be worth serious money if they were properly documented. Hope you keep good records. Dad's response was brief but revealing. Good to hear from you, Eddie. Don't worry about the documentation. Everything was handled through proper channels. Maya's going to be fine when the time comes. So Dad had been in touch with at least one member of his unit about the discovery, and that person had connections to the archaeological community. If Linda had tracked down Martinez, it was possible she'd learned enough to start asking more specific questions about the nature of Dad's find. Saturday morning's meeting included the entire legal team, and Dr. Vance had clearly briefed everyone about the urgency of our situation. Marcus Rivera, the appraiser, had brought several reference books and a portable authentication kit, ready to begin the formal evaluation process as soon as we could access the safe deposit box. Jennifer Chen, the tax attorney, had prepared preliminary calculations for the inheritance tax implications, along with several strategies for minimizing the financial burden. The good news is that your father's careful documentation should qualify this as a legitimate archaeological discovery rather than simple treasure hunting, which affects how the IRS categorizes the inheritance. David Park, the accountant, had developed a timeline for converting portions of the collection to currency while maintaining the value of the remaining pieces. We'll want to work with established auction houses and private collectors who specialize in ancient artifacts. The key is to avoid flooding the market, which could depress prices. But Dr. Vance's primary concern was protecting my legal claim before anyone else could challenge it. We need to file formal notices with the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the IRS, establishing your inheritance claim and your father's legal right to the artifacts. Once those filings are complete, it becomes much more difficult for other parties to contest your ownership. The team's efficiency was impressive, but their urgency was also unsettling. These were professionals who dealt with complex legal situations regularly, and they clearly believed that time was a critical factor in protecting my interests. How long do we have before someone else could potentially challenge my claim? I asked. Dr. Vance exchanged glances with the other attorneys. If your stepfamily discovers the nature of your father's discovery and decides to contest the will, they could potentially argue that artifacts of this value should have been specifically mentioned in the estate documents. It's not a strong legal argument, but it could tie up the inheritance in probate for months or years. Jennifer Chen nodded grimly. More concerning would be if they contacted federal agencies directly, claiming that your father might have improperly acquired the artifacts. Even if their claims were baseless, the investigation process could freeze your access to the collection indefinitely. The meeting concluded with a detailed action plan. We would travel to San Francisco the following Monday to formally authenticate and document the collection, then immediately file all necessary legal claims to establish my ownership. The process would cost several $1,000s in legal and appraisal fees, but everyone agreed that the investment was essential for protecting the larger inheritance. As I drove home from the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was racing against time in a competition I didn't fully understand. Dad had spent 14 years carefully navigating the legal complexities of his discovery, but I was having to compress that same process into a matter of weeks because of family dynamics he'd probably never anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on me. Linda and Connor had dismissed Dad's diary as worthless, but their greed was now driving them to investigate the very military service they'd never respected while he was alive. They had no idea that their fishing expedition was about to force me into claiming one of the most valuable archaeological inheritances in recent history. But I was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about protecting $12 million in ancient gold. This was about honoring my father's legacy, preserving the careful work he'd done to ensure that cultural treasures survived both war and greed. He'd trusted me with something extraordinary, and I was determined not to let him down. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp San Francisco fog that made everything feel shrouded in mystery. I met the legal team at the Bank of San Francisco at precisely 9 a.m., each of us carrying specialized equipment and documentation for what Dr. Vance had described as the most critical phase of establishing my inheritance claim. Marcus Rivera had brought a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer, professional photography equipment, and a collection of reference materials that looked like they belonged in a university library. Jennifer Chen carried a briefcase full of legal forms, while David Park had prepared detailed spreadsheets for cataloging and valuing each individual piece. Dr. Vance supervised the entire operation with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every detail mattered. Mrs. Chen, the bank manager, had arranged for us to use the bank's largest private viewing room, a space typically reserved for estate attorneys and their clients. She seemed impressed by the professional team I'd assembled, though she maintained the discreet neutrality that probably came with decades of protecting other people's secrets. When we opened the canvas bag for the first time in front of witnesses, the reaction was immediate and profound. Marcus Rivera, who'd spent his career examining ancient artifacts, actually gasped when he saw the collection. "This is museum quality material," he said, carefully lifting a gold bracelet that had been crafted sometime during the Hellenistic period. "These pieces aren't just valuable, they're historically significant." Each artifact told a story that stretched back thousands of years. There were coins bearing the images of long-dead kings, jewelry that had adorned wealthy merchants, small sculptures that had once decorated temples or palaces. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that represented the pinnacle of ancient metallurgy and artistic achievement. Dr. Vance documented everything with legal precision, creating a formal inventory that would serve as the foundation for our inheritance claim. Jennifer Chen cross-referenced each piece with the documentation Dad had left, verifying that every item had been properly cataloged and accounted for during the original military discovery process. But it was David Park who delivered the news that changed everything. After spending 2 hours with his calculator and reference materials, he looked up from his spreadsheets with an expression of barely controlled excitement. "Maya, your father was conservative in his value estimate. Based on current market prices for similar artifacts, this collection is worth closer to $18 million, not 12. The number hit me like a physical blow. $18 million. More money than I could have imagined in my wildest dreams. Enough to change not just my life, but the lives of everyone around me. I sat there staring at ancient gold that had survived wars, conquests, and centuries of upheaval, only to end up in a bank vault in San Francisco, waiting for a medical technician from Long Beach to claim it. Marcus Rivera continued his examination, occasionally pointing out particularly rare or significant pieces. "This coin here is from the reign of Antigonus I, one of Alexander's successors. There are maybe a dozen examples known to exist in private collections worldwide." He carefully photographed it from multiple angles, creating documentation that would be essential for insurance and authentication purposes. "And this," he said, lifting a small golden figurine of a horse and rider, "appears to be Scythian work, probably from the 4th century BCE. The detailed work is incredible, and the preservation is remarkable." He shook his head in amazement. "Your father must have found this in a cache that was sealed and protected from the elements for over 2,000 years." Dr. Vance was busy filling out federal forms, establishing the legal framework for my inheritance claim. Maya, I need you to sign these documents acknowledging your ownership of the collection and your intention to comply with all federal regulations regarding the importation and taxation of cultural artifacts. I signed where she indicated, my signature looking shaky next to the official seals and legal language that would formally establish my claim to $18 million in ancient treasure. Each signature felt like I was committing to a future I couldn't quite envision, accepting responsibility for something that felt too large and significant for one person to handle. Jennifer Chen had been quiet for most of the morning, but now she looked up from her legal pad with a concerned expression. Maya, we need to discuss the tax implications of this revised valuation. At $18 million, your inheritance tax burden is going to be substantial, probably around $6 million depending on various factors. $6 million in taxes. The amount was staggering, but Dr. Vance had anticipated this issue. The good news is that we have several options for managing the tax burden. You can sell portions of the collection to cover the taxes, or we can arrange for structured payments over several years. The key is to work with the IRS proactively rather than trying to avoid or minimize your obligations. As we completed the formal documentation process, my phone buzzed with a text message from Connor. Hey, talk to more of Dad's army buddies? Sounds like he might have found some cool stuff overseas. Want to grab lunch and discuss? The timing felt ominous, like he was somehow aware of what I was doing at that exact moment. I showed the message to Dr. Vance, who frowned as she read it. Maya, I think we need to accelerate our filing timeline. If your stepfamily is actively investigating your father's military service, they might stumble across information that could complicate your position. She made several phone calls from the bank's conference room, speaking in rapid legal jargon to contacts at various federal agencies. By the end of the afternoon, she'd managed to expedite our formal inheritance claim, filing preliminary documents with the State Department, the IRS, and the Department of Defense that established my legal right to the collection. These filings create what's essentially a legal firewall, she explained. Even if someone else tries to challenge your inheritance, they'll have to go through official channels and prove that your father's acquisition of the artifacts was improper. Given the documentation we have, that would be extremely difficult. Marcus Rivera completed his authentication process by late afternoon, creating a comprehensive report that cataloged each piece and established its historical significance and market value. Maya, you're not just inheriting money, he said as he packed up his equipment. You're inheriting a collection that represents thousands of years of human history. These artifacts survived the fall of empires, foreign invasions, and countless other disasters. Now they're yours to protect. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. I'd gone from worrying about paying rent to being responsible for preserving artifacts that belonged in museums, pieces that scholars would study and treasure hunters would kill for. As we prepared to return the collection to the safe deposit box, David Park handed me a preliminary financial plan. Maya, I've outlined several options for how you might want to handle this inheritance. You could sell the entire collection and invest the proceeds conservatively, which would give you financial security for life. Or you could keep the most significant pieces and sell others selectively, maintaining the collection while generating income. He'd also included a third option that I hadn't considered: donating portions of the collection to museums in exchange for tax benefits and the satisfaction of making the artifacts available for public education and research. Your father spent his deployment protecting cultural heritage, David said. You might want to consider continuing that mission in your own way. The drive back to Long Beach gave me hours to process everything that had happened. In a single day, I'd gone from being a struggling medical technician to being the owner of one of the most valuable private archaeological collections in the world. The legal paperwork was filed, the authentication was complete, and the inheritance was officially mine. But I was also beginning to understand that claiming the inheritance was just the beginning. Now I had to decide what to do with $18 million in ancient gold, how to handle the inevitable attention that would come with such a discovery, and most importantly, how to honor my father's legacy while building a future that reflected my own values and priorities. Connor texted me twice more during the drive home, each message more insistent about meeting to discuss Dad's military stuff. Linda called once, leaving a voicemail about how she'd been thinking about Jim's service record and wondering if there might be valuable historical documents that needed proper preservation. Their increased interest was no longer subtle or casual. Something had triggered their suspicion, and they were actively investigating Dad's military history. Dr. Vance had been right about the timing being critical. If I'd waited much longer to claim the inheritance, I might have found myself fighting a legal battle with family members who dismissed Dad's legacy while he was alive, but were now eager to profit from it after his death. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized that my life had just changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow, I would wake up as one of the wealthiest people I knew, responsible for artifacts that were older than Christianity, artifacts that my father had spent 14 years protecting and preserving for me. The question was whether I was strong enough to handle that kind of responsibility and smart enough to navigate the complex world I was about to enter. But sitting in my car, holding the legal documents that proved my ownership of $18 million in ancient treasure, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope for the future. Dad had believed in me enough to trust me with something extraordinary. Now I had to prove that his faith had been justified. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 12 voicemails, all from Linda. Her messages started concerned and escalated quickly to frantic. Maya, call me immediately. We need to talk about your father's military records. Connor found something online about archaeological discoveries in Afghanistan. This is important. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to her voice become increasingly agitated with each message. By the final voicemail, recorded at 2:47 a.m., she was no longer pretending to be the caring stepmother. Maya, I know you're hiding something. Jim's army buddy Martinez told us about the artifact reports. If you found something valuable that should be part of the estate, we have legal rights. Call me back or I'm contacting my attorney. So that was it. Linda had connected enough dots to realize Dad's military service might have involved valuable discoveries, and she was preparing to challenge my inheritance. The timing was eerily coincidental, coming just one day after I'd filed my formal ownership claims with federal agencies. I called Dr. Vance's office immediately, reaching her answering service. Within 20 minutes, she called me back, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. Maya, tell me exactly what Linda said in those messages. I played the most revealing voicemails over the phone, listening to Dr. Vance's sharp intake of breath when Linda mentioned archaeological discoveries and legal rights. This is concerning, but not unexpected, she said. The good news is that our filings yesterday establish your legal position. However, we need to be prepared for Linda to escalate the situation. She advised me to document everything, save all the voicemails, screenshot any text messages, and avoid direct contact with Linda or Connor until we could develop a strategy. Don't give them any information they can use against you. If they want to challenge your inheritance, they'll need to do it through proper legal channels. But avoiding Linda proved impossible. She appeared at my apartment that evening, accompanied by Connor and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Attorney Robert Marsh. Linda's usual composed demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled fury. Her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled, and her makeup smudged from what had clearly been a stressful day. Maya, we need to talk, she said, pushing past me into my small living room. This is about your father's estate and some very serious legal issues that have come to light. Connor looked uncomfortable, probably realizing that this confrontation was more aggressive than he'd anticipated. Attorney Marsh seemed professional but predatory, the kind of lawyer who specializes in finding ways to challenge inheritances and estate settlements. I'm sorry, but I can't discuss my father's estate without my own legal representation present, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. If you have concerns about the will or the distribution of assets, you'll need to address them through proper channels. Linda's composure cracked completely. Don't play games with me, Maya. We know Jim found something valuable during his deployment. Martinez told us about the archaeological reports, the coordination with international authorities. If your father discovered artifacts worth millions of dollars, those discoveries are part of his estate. Attorney Marsh stepped forward, his voice smooth and threatening. Ms. Castellanos, My clients have reason to believe that you may have concealed valuable assets during the estate settlement process. Concealing inherited property is a serious legal matter that could result in criminal charges. The accusation hit me like a slap, but Dr. Vance's coaching kicked in. I haven't concealed anything. My father's will was properly executed, and all beneficiaries received their designated inheritances. If you believe there are additional assets that should have been included, you're welcome to petition the probate court. Connor finally spoke up, his voice lacking his usual confidence. Maya, we're not trying to take anything away from you. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly. If Dad found treasure or artifacts, there might be legal issues about how they were brought into the country. That was a more sophisticated concern than I'd expected from Connor, suggesting that Attorney Marsh had been coaching them on potential vulnerabilities in my position. The implication was clear. Even if I had legal right to the artifacts, they might try to create problems with federal agencies about importation or documentation. Linda sat down uninvited, her eyes scanning my apartment as if looking for evidence of sudden wealth. Maya, I'm going to be direct. Martinez told us that Jim was involved in documenting archaeological discoveries worth potentially millions of dollars. Those discoveries would be subject to federal regulations, international treaties, and significant tax implications. She leaned forward, her voice taking on a falsely sympathetic tone. Honey, if you've inherited something like that, you're going to need help navigating the legal complexities. Let us assist you. We can share the burden of managing valuable assets and ensure everything is handled properly. The offer was transparently motivated by greed, but it was also more dangerous than I'd realized. Linda wasn't just fishing for information anymore. She was positioning herself as a helpful partner who deserved to share in whatever Dad had left me. Attorney Marsh pulled out a folder of documents. Ms. Castellanos, we've prepared a proposal for restructuring your father's estate to properly account for any archaeological discoveries. This would involve creating a family trust that would protect the assets while ensuring appropriate distribution among all beneficiaries. I didn't need to read the documents to understand what they were proposing. They wanted to force me to share Dad's discovery with them, using the threat of legal challenges and federal investigations to pressure me into compliance. I need time to review this with my own attorney, I said, standing up to signal that the meeting was over. You can leave those documents, and I'll have my legal counsel respond appropriately. Linda stood as well, her mask of concern finally slipping completely. Maya, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We know you found something significant. Oh, the question is whether you want to handle this cooperatively or whether we need to involve federal authorities in investigating how these artifacts were acquired and imported. The threat was explicit now. If I didn't agree to share Dad's discovery, they would try to create legal problems that could tie up the inheritance indefinitely. They were betting that I couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle, that the stress and uncertainty would force me to accept their terms. Attorney Marsh handed me his business card. Ms. Castellanos, I strongly advise you to consult with qualified legal counsel before making any decisions about valuable archaeological materials. The federal regulations governing such discoveries are complex and mistakes can have serious consequences. After they left, I sat in my living room, holding their documents and trying to process what had just happened. Linda and Connor had moved from suspicious to openly hostile in less than 24 hours. They'd hired an attorney, developed a legal strategy, and presented me with what amounted to an ultimatum. I called Dr. Vance immediately, describing the confrontation in detail. Her response was swift and decisive. Maya, this changes everything. They're not just challenging your inheritance anymore. They're threatening to involve federal agencies in questioning the legitimacy of your father's discovery. We need to move quickly to protect your position. She scheduled an emergency meeting for the next morning, explaining that we needed to prepare for what could become a complex legal battle involving estate law, international regulations, and federal oversight of archaeological discoveries. As I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a fight that was much larger and more dangerous than I'd anticipated. Dad had spent 14 years carefully protecting his discovery, but Linda and Connor were threatening to destroy that careful work in a matter of days. The stakes were no longer just about money. They were about protecting Dad's legacy, honoring his service, and ensuring that greed didn't triumph over the careful legal work he'd done to preserve cultural treasures for future generations. The emergency meeting at Dr. Vance's office felt like a war council. Jennifer Chen had brought additional legal resources, including a specialist in federal archaeological regulations named Dr. Michael Torres, who'd previously worked with the State Department on cultural property cases. David Park had prepared financial projections for various legal scenarios, while Marcus Rivera had compiled authentication reports that could withstand federal scrutiny. Dr. Vance opened the meeting with grim efficiency. Maya, Linda's attorney is more sophisticated than we initially thought. Robert Marsh specializes in challenging high value inheritances, and his threat to involve federal agencies isn't empty posturing. He's used similar tactics successfully in other cases. Dr. Torres leaned forward, his expression serious. The concerning part is his focus on importation documentation. Even though your father followed proper procedures, Marsh will try to find technical violations or procedural gaps that could cast doubt on the legitimacy of the artifact's presence in the United States. Jennifer Chen had spent the night researching Marsh's previous cases, and her findings were unsettling. He's successfully challenged 3 major estate settlements in the past 5 years by raising questions about international asset acquisition. His strategy is to create enough legal uncertainty that beneficiaries settle rather than face prolonged federal investigations. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Even with Dad's meticulous documentation, I could find myself fighting a battle on multiple fronts: a state court, federal agencies, and possibly international treaty organizations, all while Linda and Connor pressured me to accept their partnership proposal. Dr. Vance pulled out a thick folder. However, we have advantages they don't know about. Your father's documentation is extraordinary, and our federal filings yesterday established your legal position before they could challenge it. Most importantly, we have allies in the archaeological community who can testify to the legitimacy of your father's work. She'd contacted Colonel Williams at the Army Heritage Center, who'd agreed to provide testimony about Dad's role in the cultural preservation program. Additionally, Dr. Torres had reached out to contacts at the Afghan National Museum, who confirmed that Dad's discovery had been properly reported and that the required portion had been donated as specified by international treaty. The challenge, Dr. Vance continued, is that legal battles like this can take years to resolve, during which time your access to the inheritance could be frozen. We need to consider whether it's worth fighting or whether some form of settlement might be preferable. The suggestion hit me like a betrayal. After everything Dad had done to protect this discovery, after 14 years of careful legal work, they were suggesting I should consider giving Linda and Connor a share just to avoid a fight. No, I said firmly. My father spent 14 years ensuring this inheritance would be mine. He specifically excluded Linda from access to the safe deposit box because he didn't trust her. I'm not going to hand over part of his legacy because she hired a threatening attorney. Marcus Rivera nodded approvingly. Maya's right. This collection represents more than money. It's cultural heritage that her father protected through proper legal channels. Giving into extortion would dishonor both his service and his sacrifice. David Park had been quietly calculating numbers throughout the discussion. There's another factor to consider. If Maya fights this battle and wins, she retains control over $18 million in assets. If she settles and gives Linda's family a significant share, she might end up with less money than the legal battle would cost. Dr. Torres had been studying the documents Marsh had left with me. His legal theory is actually quite weak. He argues that archaeological discoveries should automatically be considered part of the estate assets, but that contradicts established precedent for military cultural preservation programs. The artifacts belong to Maya because her father acquired them through proper military channels and processed them as personal property. Jennifer Chen looked up from her legal research. The real question is whether Marsh will actually follow through on his threats to involve federal agencies. That's a high-risk strategy for him, because if the agencies determine that the artifacts were properly acquired, his clients could face sanctions for making false accusations. Dr. Vance seemed to reach a decision. Maya, if you're committed to fighting this, we need to take immediate action to neutralize their threats. I propose we schedule a formal meeting with Marsh and present our evidence, making it clear that we're prepared for a full legal battle if necessary. She outlined a strategy that was both defensive and aggressive. We would document Linda's attempts at intimidation, file formal complaints if she continued harassing me, and most importantly, invite federal agencies to conduct their own review of the artifact's provenance rather than wait for Marsh to make accusations. By proactively requesting federal review, we control the narrative, Dr. Torres explained. We present the evidence on our terms, demonstrate full compliance with regulations, and show that we have nothing to hide. That makes it much harder for opposing counsel to claim there are improprieties. The meeting concluded with a detailed action plan. Dr. Vance would contact Marsh to schedule a formal conference, while Dr. Torres would coordinate with federal agencies for a voluntary compliance review. Jennifer Chen would prepare counterclaims against Linda and Connor if they continued their harassment, and David Park would begin the process of establishing secure storage and insurance for the collection. But as I drove home from the meeting, my phone started buzzing with notifications that made my stomach drop. Someone had posted about me on social media, and the information was spreading rapidly across multiple platforms. The original post was on a military history forum, written by someone using the name Army Vet 2009, almost certainly Martinez, Dad's former unit member. The post was titled, Gold Discovery in Afghanistan, Legal Dispute Brewing, and contained enough specific details about Dad's service and archaeological work to attract serious attention. Looking for information about legal issues surrounding archaeological discoveries made during military service in Afghanistan. Specifically interested in cases where discoveries might have been improperly claimed as personal property rather than being reported through official channels. Know of a situation where family members might be hiding valuable artifacts that should be subject to federal oversight. The post had already attracted dozens of responses, including several from people claiming expertise in military law, archaeological regulations, and international treaty compliance. Some responses were supportive of Dad's actions, but others questioned whether any military personnel should be allowed to claim personal ownership of artifacts discovered during deployment. More concerning were the responses that mentioned my name specifically and referenced ongoing legal disputes about the inheritance. Someone had clearly provided detailed information about my situation, possibly Linda or Connor attempting to create public pressure for their cause. I called Dr. Vance immediately, reading her the most problematic posts over the phone. Her response was swift and angry. This is witness intimidation and public harassment, designed to influence potential legal proceedings. We're filing for an emergency restraining order first thing tomorrow morning. But the damage was already spreading. Local news outlets had picked up the story, framing it as a dispute over millions in war treasure and questioning whether military personnel should be allowed to profit from archaeological discoveries made during deployment. My name and Linda's name were both mentioned, along with enough details about Dad's service to make the story feel credible and newsworthy. By evening, I had reporters calling my apartment, neighbors asking questions about news vans in the parking lot, and colleagues at the medical center wondering why my name was being mentioned in stories about treasure hunting and legal disputes. The private inheritance battle I'd hoped to handle discreetly had become a public spectacle, with online forums debating the ethics of military archaeological discoveries and news outlets treating Dad's sacrifice and service as entertainment fodder. Linda had escalated beyond simple legal threats. She'd turned my father's legacy into a public relations battlefield, gambling that media attention and social pressure would force me to accept her demands rather than continue fighting for what Dad had left me. The question now was whether I had the strength to fight not just a legal battle, but a public one, defending both my inheritance and my father's honor against people who'd never respected either while he was alive. The media circus intensified over the next 48 hours, transforming my quiet life into a nightmare of public scrutiny. Reporters camped outside my apartment building, my workplace, and even tracked down my college friends looking for quotes about my character and financial situation. The local evening news ran a segment titled Treasure Hunter or Rightful Heir that featured unflattering photos of me taken with telephoto lenses and interviews with neighbors who barely knew my name. Linda had clearly orchestrated a comprehensive media strategy, She appeared on three different news programs, presenting herself as the grieving widow concerned about proper legal procedures and cultural preservation. Her performance was masterful, dressed in conservative black, speaking in measured tones about her late husband's dedication to protecting historical artifacts and her worry that valuable cultural treasures might not be properly preserved. Jim would have wanted these discoveries to benefit educational institutions and museums, she told Channel 7's evening anchor. We're simply asking for transparency and proper oversight to ensure his legacy is honored appropriately. She never directly accused me of wrongdoing, but her implications were clear to anyone watching. Connor played his role perfectly too, appearing as the concerned stepson who just wanted to make sure his stepfather's military service was properly honored. Dad always taught us about the importance of doing the right thing, he said during a radio interview. We just want to make sure these artifacts are handled the way he would have wanted. Their strategy was brilliant and infuriating. They positioned themselves as the responsible family members concerned about cultural preservation and legal compliance, while painting me as the secretive daughter trying to hide valuable discoveries from proper oversight. The fact that Dad had specifically excluded them from access to his most precious legacy became irrelevant in the court of public opinion. Dr. Vance worked around the clock to counter their narrative, but fighting a media battle while preparing for legal proceedings stretched our resources thin. She arranged for Colonel Williams to give interviews about Dad's exemplary service and proper documentation procedures, while Dr. Torres provided background to reporters about the legitimacy of military cultural preservation programs. The turning point came when Dr. Vance discovered something that changed everything. While reviewing Attorney Marsh's previous cases, her research team found a pattern that was both shocking and perfectly illegal. In four of his successful inheritance challenges, Marsh had received contingency fees that exceeded legal limits, suggesting he was taking percentages of recovered assets rather than standard attorney fees. More damaging was evidence that Marsh had been feeding information to media contacts before filing formal legal challenges, using public pressure to force settlements in cases where his legal position was weak. Phone records subpoenaed from his previous cases showed calls to journalists and bloggers in the days before inheritance disputes became public. Maya, this is huge, Dr. Vance said during an emergency strategy session. Marsh has been running what amounts to a legal extortion scheme, using media manipulation to pressure beneficiaries into settlements they're not legally required to make. Jennifer Chen had prepared a comprehensive filing documenting Marsh's pattern of behavior, including evidence that he'd contacted the Military History Forum, where the first post about my situation had appeared. We can prove that Linda's attorney orchestrated the media attention, which violates several professional conduct rules and possibly criminal statutes. But we needed more than just evidence of Marsh's misconduct. We needed to demonstrate that Dad's discovery was completely legitimate and that my inheritance was legally unassailable. That required taking a significant risk, allowing federal agencies to conduct a full review of the artifacts and documentation, knowing that any problems they found could jeopardize the entire inheritance. Dr. Torres coordinated with contacts at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the IRS to arrange for a comprehensive review of Dad's documentation and the artifacts themselves. If we can get clean bills of health from all relevant federal agencies, Linda and Connor lose any basis for their challenges, he explained. The federal review process was exhaustive and nerve-wracking. Teams of experts examined every piece in the collection, cross-referenced Dad's military reports with official deployment records, and verified that all required notifications and documentation had been properly filed during the original discovery process. Colonel Williams provided crucial testimony about Dad's role in the cultural preservation program and the procedures that had been followed during archaeological discoveries. His testimony painted a picture of my father as a dedicated professional who'd gone above and beyond requirements to ensure proper documentation and legal compliance. The archaeological experts were particularly impressed by the quality of Dad's work. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Smithsonian Institution, who reviewed the collection as part of the federal assessment, described Dad's documentation as exemplary, exceeding standards typically required for military archaeological discoveries. After 2 weeks of intensive review, the federal agencies issued their findings. The artifacts had been properly discovered, documented, and claimed through appropriate legal channels. Dad's importation of the collection had followed all required procedures, and my inheritance was completely legitimate under both domestic and international law. The State Department's official letter was particularly satisfying. James Castellanos followed exemplary procedures in documenting and claiming archaeological discoveries made during his military service. His daughter, Maya Castellanos, is the rightful owner of the collection, and no federal agencies have any concerns about the legitimacy of her inheritance. Armed with federal validation, Dr. Vance went on the offensive. She held a press conference announcing the government's findings while simultaneously filing formal complaints against Attorney Marsh for professional misconduct and criminal harassment. The evidence of his media manipulation and extortion scheme was presented to both the State Bar Association and federal prosecutors. The media narrative shifted overnight. Linda and Connor, who'd positioned themselves as concerned family members seeking proper oversight, were suddenly exposed as opportunistic relatives trying to steal a legitimate inheritance through intimidation and public manipulation. Marsh abandoned his clients within 24 hours of the federal findings being released, leaving Linda and Connor without legal representation and facing potential sanctions for making false accusations against federal agencies. Their carefully orchestrated media campaign collapsed when reporters realized they'd been manipulated as part of an attempted inheritance theft. The vindication felt amazing, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life that I was still trying to understand. With federal validation securing my legal position and Marsh's misconduct exposed, I finally had the breathing room to make decisions about what to do with Dad's extraordinary legacy. The $18 million collection was undeniably mine, but more importantly, I now understood the full scope of what my father had accomplished during his military service. The vindication in the media was swift and complete. News outlets that had questioned the legitimacy of my inheritance now ran follow-up stories praising Dad's exemplary service and condemning Linda and Connor's attempted manipulation. The military history forums that had initially spread doubts about the discovery now featured detailed posts celebrating Dad's contribution to cultural preservation. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rashid Ahmadi, the director of the Afghan National Museum, contacted me directly to express his gratitude for my father's work. "Your father was instrumental in preserving our cultural heritage during a very difficult time," he told me during a video call. "The artifacts he discovered and properly documented represent an important piece of our history. We are grateful that they have been preserved by someone who understands their significance." Dr. Ahmadi explained that the portion of the discovery Dad had donated to the museum had become one of their most important exhibitions, helping to educate visitors about the rich cultural history of Afghanistan before the conflicts that had defined the region in recent decades. "Your father's work helped ensure that future generations will understand the beauty and sophistication of our ancient civilizations," he said. This conversation crystallized something I'd been struggling with since first discovering the inheritance. The artifacts weren't just valuable objects. They were pieces of human history that had survived thousands of years of upheaval, war, and cultural destruction. Dad had protected them not just as treasure, but as irreplaceable links to civilizations that deserved to be remembered and studied. With that understanding, I made a decision that surprised even my legal team. Rather than simply selling the collection and investing the proceeds, I wanted to continue Dad's mission of cultural preservation while also securing my own financial future. Working with Dr. Torres and Marcus Rivera, I developed a comprehensive plan that would honor both Dad's legacy and my own values. I would donate the most historically significant pieces to major museums, creating a traveling exhibition that would educate the public about ancient civilizations and the importance of protecting cultural heritage during times of conflict. The remaining pieces would be sold through carefully selected auction houses and private collectors, with the proceeds invested to create an endowment fund supporting archaeological research and cultural preservation programs. The fund would provide grants to researchers working in conflict zones, helping to protect cultural sites and artifacts the way Dad had protected this discovery. David Park ran the financial projections for this plan, and the numbers were staggering in the best possible way. Even after donating millions of dollars worth of artifacts to museums, the remaining collection would generate enough income to make me financially independent for life while funding significant charitable work. Maya, you're essentially creating a foundation that will continue your father's work long after we're all gone, Dr. Vance said as we reviewed the final proposal. It's a remarkable way to honor his legacy while building something meaningful for yourself. The plan also had practical advantages. The tax benefits from the museum donations would significantly reduce my inheritance tax burden, while the establishment of a charitable foundation would provide ongoing tax advantages and professional fulfillment. Instead of simply being wealthy, I would be actively contributing to causes that mattered. But implementing this plan required one final confrontation with Linda and Connor, who had been conspicuously quiet since Marsh abandoned them and federal agencies validated my inheritance. They'd retreated from public view, presumably hoping the controversy would fade and people would forget their failed attempt to steal Dad's legacy. I decided to handle this confrontation on my own terms, in a setting that would make the power dynamics crystal clear. I arranged to meet them at the law office where Dad's will had originally been read, the same conference room where they'd received their modest inheritances while dismissing his diary as worthless. Linda arrived wearing the same composed mask she'd perfected during her marriage to Dad, but I could see the strain around her eyes. Connor looked sullen and defensive, probably still processing how badly their scheme had backfired. Neither of them brought an attorney, having learned that legal threats weren't going to work against someone with federal agencies backing their position. Linda, Connor, I said as they took seats across from me, I wanted to speak with you directly about Dad's estate and the future of our family relationships. Linda's composure cracked slightly. Maya, I hope you understand that we were only trying to protect your interests. The legal complexities around archaeological discoveries can be overwhelming, and we thought you might need assistance. It was a pathetic attempt to rewrite history, pretending their extortion attempt had been motivated by concern for my welfare. Connor didn't even try to maintain the pretense, staring at the table while his mother dug their hole deeper. Actually, Linda, I want to thank you, I said, enjoying the confused look that crossed her face. Your investigation into Dad's military service led me to discover something I never would have known otherwise. Dad wasn't just a soldier who did his job and came home. He was a cultural preservation specialist who spent his deployment protecting irreplaceable pieces of human history. I pulled out copies of the federal reports validating Dad's work, along with testimonial letters from Colonel Williams, Dr. Amati, and other experts who'd praised his contribution to archaeological preservation. Dad was a hero, Linda, not just because he served his country, but because he helped preserve cultural treasures that would have been lost forever without his intervention. Linda's face flushed as she realized I was turning their attempted manipulation into a celebration of the man they'd never properly appreciated while he was alive. The $18 million he left me isn't just an inheritance, I continued. It's the foundation for continuing his work, supporting archaeological research and cultural preservation programs around the world. I'm establishing the James Castellanos Foundation for cultural heritage protection, using Dad's discovery to fund the kind of work he dedicated his life to. Connor finally looked up, his expression mixing surprise with what might have been grudging respect. Linda looked like she was calculating whether there might still be some angle she could exploit, some way to insert herself into this new narrative. Of course, family support would be welcome, I said, watching Linda's eyes light up with renewed hope. The foundation will need volunteers for administrative work, event planning, and fundraising activities, all unpaid positions naturally, but meaningful ways to honor Dad's memory. The offer to work for free at a foundation, funded by the inheritance they'd tried to steal, was my final move in this family chess game. Linda could either accept a minor supporting role in Dad's legacy, or continue to be remembered as the stepmother who'd tried to profit from his sacrifice. 6 months later, I stood in the grand hall of the Smithsonian Institution, watching visitors examine the inaugural exhibition of the James Castellanos collection. The artifacts that had once been hidden in a San Francisco bank vault were now beautifully displayed under museum lighting, each piece accompanied by detailed information about its historical significance and the story of its preservation. The exhibition opening was more emotional than I'd anticipated. Seeing families with children gathered around the ancient coins and jewelry, reading about the civilizations that had created these treasures thousands of years ago, made Dad's sacrifice feel genuinely meaningful. A group of middle school students pressed their faces against the display cases, marveling at the craftsmanship of Hellenistic goldsmiths who'd died centuries before Christ was born. Dr. Ahmadi had flown in from Kabul for the opening ceremony, bringing with him photographs of the companion pieces that Dad had donated to the Afghan National Museum. Your father understood something that many people miss. He told the gathered crowd during his speech. Cultural heritage belongs to all of humanity, not just to the nation where it was discovered. By preserving these artifacts through proper legal channels, he ensured that future generations could learn from our shared history. Colonel Williams was there too, wearing his dress uniform and speaking with the dignity that had made him such an effective advocate for Dad's legacy. James Castellanos represented the best of American military service, he said. He understood that protecting cultural heritage was just as important as any other aspect of his mission. These artifacts survived because of his dedication to doing things the right way. The financial results of the foundation exceeded even David Park's optimistic projections. The auction of the remaining artifacts had generated nearly $14 million, which had been invested in a diversified portfolio designed to fund cultural preservation projects indefinitely. The tax benefits from the museum donations had reduced my personal tax burden to manageable levels, while still leaving me with enough personal wealth to never worry about financial security again. But more importantly, the foundation was already making a difference in the field. We'd funded 3 archaeological expeditions in conflict zones, provided equipment for 2 university research programs, and established a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in cultural preservation. The work felt like a natural continuation of Dad's military service, protecting cultural treasures from destruction and ensuring they could be studied and appreciated by future generations. Linda had surprised me by actually accepting the volunteer position I'd offered, though her motivations remained transparently self-serving. She'd appointed herself as the foundation's community outreach coordinator, a role that mainly involved organizing fundraising events where she could network with wealthy donors and bask in reflected glory from Dad's legacy. But even her shallow involvement served a purpose. Linda's social connections had opened doors to potential donors and partner organizations that might have taken years to develop otherwise. Her need for social status aligned perfectly with the foundation's need for visibility and funding, creating an arrangement that benefited everyone involved. Connor had been more resistant to participating in the foundation's work, but he'd eventually found a role that suited his interests. His background in construction and his connections to military contractors had made him valuable for coordinating the logistics of archaeological expeditions. He wasn't passionate about cultural preservation, but he was good at organizing complex projects and ensuring that research teams had the equipment and support they needed. The most meaningful validation came from the archaeological community itself. The Castellanos Foundation had quickly gained recognition as a serious organization that funded legitimate research and preservation work. Dr. Mitchell from the Smithsonian had joined our advisory board, along with several other respected experts who helped guide our grant-making decisions. Maya, what you've built here is exactly what the field needs, Dr. Mitchell told me during the exhibition opening. Too many valuable sites are being destroyed by conflict or neglect because there's no funding for proper preservation work. Your father's discovery is now protecting cultural heritage around the world. The personal transformation had been just as significant as the professional one. I'd left my job at the medical center to focus on the foundation full-time, moving from a cramped apartment in Long Beach to a modest house in Pasadena that could serve as both my home and the foundation's headquarters. The change from worrying about rent to managing millions of dollars in charitable assets had been surreal, but it had also given me a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. More importantly, I'd finally understood who my father really was. Not the distant, sometimes troubled veteran I'd thought I knew, but a man who dedicated his life to protecting things that mattered, both during his military service and in the careful legal work he'd done to preserve his discovery for me. The diary that Connor had dismissed as worthless had contained the key to understanding Dad's true character and his hopes for my future. The exhibition would travel to museums across the country over the next 2 years, sharing Dad's story and the artifacts he'd preserved with millions of visitors. Each stop would include educational programs about cultural preservation, archaeological methods, and the importance of protecting heritage sites during times of conflict. Standing in the Smithsonian that evening, surrounded by ancient treasures that had survived wars, conquests, and centuries of upheaval, I felt connected to something larger than myself. Dad's legacy wasn't just about money or even about the specific artifacts he'd discovered. It was about the principle that cultural heritage deserved protection, that the achievements of past civilizations should be preserved for future generations to study and appreciate. The girl who'd once been dismissed as a disappointment by her family had become the steward of irreplaceable cultural treasures and the founder of an organization that would continue protecting such treasures long after I was gone. Dad had been right to trust me with something extraordinary. I'd proven worthy of that trust, and in doing so, had discovered who I was meant to be. 2 years after the Smithsonian opening, I received a call that brought everything full circle. Dr. Ahmadi was on the line from Kabul, his voice filled with excitement I'd rarely heard before. Maya, we've made an incredible discovery. Another cache, probably from the same merchant caravan your father found, but this one is still in the ground, and we need help protecting it from looters while we conduct proper excavation. The request was exactly what the Castellanos Foundation had been created for, protecting cultural heritage in conflict zones. Within a week, I was on a plane to Afghanistan, carrying equipment funded by Dad's legacy and accompanied by a team of archaeologists who understood that they were continuing his work. Standing at the excavation site near Kandahar, I could see the mountains where Dad had served, the landscape he'd described in his diary entries. The local tribal elder who guided us to the site was the grandson of the man Dad had worked with decades earlier. Your father was a good man, he told me through our translator. He understood that these treasures belonged to history, not to any one person. The new discovery yielded artifacts even more spectacular than Dad's original find: golden vessels, ceremonial weapons, and jewelry that told the story of ancient trade routes connecting civilizations across continents. But this time, everything was documented from the moment of discovery, with Afghan archaeologists leading the excavation and international experts providing support. As I watched the careful process of uncovering treasures that had been hidden for over 2,000 years, I realized that Dad's real gift hadn't been the $18 million he'd left me. It had been the example he'd set, showing me that some things were worth protecting, that legacy mattered more than personal profit, and that one person's careful work could preserve irreplaceable pieces of human history. The new artifacts would remain in Afghanistan, properly housed in the National Museum, where they could educate visitors about their own cultural heritage. The Castellanos Foundation would fund the conservation work, continuing the partnership Dad had established with Afghan authorities decades earlier. That evening, sitting in the same region where Dad had made his discovery, I opened his diary and read his words again. M will understand. She's the only one who gets it. He'd been right. I did understand. I understood that some discoveries are worth more than their monetary value, that true wealth comes from protecting things that matter, and that the best inheritances are the ones that keep giving long after we're gone. The foundation now operates in 12 countries, has preserved hundreds of archaeological sites, and has funded research that's rewritten chapters of ancient history. Dad's worthless diary had indeed held the key to treasure, not just the gold, but the knowledge of how to use that treasure to make the world a little bit better. Yeah, but if this story inspired you to think differently about legacy, family, and the true meaning of wealth, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances are the ones nobody else recognizes.